Hey everyone, after last week's video, I was asked by my friend TJ to do a more in-depth breakdown of how I use MIDI with Norns. I'm going to go over how I route MIDI to and from Norns, how I use TouchOSC to send MIDI over Wi-Fi, and how this can all play with external gear. Before I get into anything else, I want to show how to set up MIDI devices on Norns. It's pretty easy. The way I do it is I use my old Scarlett 2i4 connected by USB to Norns itself, and then that is connected with MIDI cables to my main interface, which is an 18i20, and the MIDI out of the 2i4 is going to the MIDI in of the 18i20, and the MIDI in of the 18i20 is going to the MIDI out of the 2i4. With these interfaces connected like this, I can send MIDI to Norns as well as receive MIDI from Norns, and having the ability to send and receive is actually very helpful. To set up a MIDI device on Norns, you go to the System menu, select Devices, select MIDI, and you'll see a list of all of the MIDI devices you have saved. Right now I have the Scarlett here, which is connected to my main interface to send MIDI to my computer, and I have my OP1, so I can send MIDI directly to the OP1 by USB. So to show this from the beginning, if I click here and I go to None, it'll remove that as a saved MIDI device. If I want to add a new one, you use button 3 to select one of the slots and then just pick out of the list. So this will be OP1. So now in any script that uses MIDI, you can just select device 2 and that will go to the OP1. In my previous videos, you've seen me sending MIDI from Norns to my computer. So I'm going to demonstrate how to send directly to a device that's connected by USB. I have the OP1 connected, and if I go to a script that outputs in MIDI, I'll use fall here. If you go to the parameters menu and you go to edit, I'm going to turn MIDI on, and I'm going to select the MIDI out as OP1. And now if I turn up the volume on the OP1, you'll hear that it is receiving MIDI. I think in last week's video I showed a lot of examples of how you can use MIDI out from Norns, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that today. I'm going to move on here to what you can do with sending MIDI to Norns. There are a lot of benefits of being able to send MIDI to Norns. MIDI mapping is incredibly convenient and adds a lot of depth to some scripts, especially ones that don't have default grid controls. For this demo, I'm going to be using Worms. Worms is one of my favorite scripts for Norns. It's made up of 2 looping buffers, one which records audio in and one that will by default record the first buffer. This allows for a lot of interesting interactions. You can use the second buffer as a delay, a pitch shifted copy of buffer A, or just as a completely independent looper. When I control parameters in Norns' scripts, I either use CCMap8, which is a Max for Live device, or TouchOSC. I'm going to show how to use CCMap8 here and cover TouchOSC in the next segment. CCMap8 is really cool because it gives you all of the control that you'd have over any parameter in Ableton, but allowing you to do that with an external piece of gear. I made a little loop on buffer 1 in Worms with OP1. And I have CCMap8 down here, and I'm going to get into mapping some of these to different parameters inside Worms. To get started mapping, first thing I'm going to do is set the MIDI output to my Focusrite USB on the track that CCMap8 is on. And then if you use button 1 and you go to the parameters menu, select map, and the first thing I want to map is the volume. So I'll use button 3 to select that. When you get into the menu, use encoder 2 to highlight learn and hit button 3. And then now when I move the knob on CC map 8, you'll hear that the volume is being changed. One way we can control the volume now is by using automation. I've drawn in some volume automation curves in this MIDI clip, and if I play this, you'll see that the volume is changing on Norns. Another way we can control the volume is by using the stock LFO plugin and mapping it to the dial 1. Now that we have the volume taken care of, we can also see what other parameters we can map. This is the controls for the octave of buffer 1. So again, I'm going to select learn, and I'm going to use this control, number 2, to map that. The octave control has a pretty wide range. So if you go to out down here, it's showing that the bottom level is -32 octaves, which will just be inaudible. So I'm going to use encoder 3 to increase that to -4. So the upper limit is 4 octaves and the lower limit is 4 octaves. That way, whatever modulation I do in here won't bring it to an inaudible level. I'm going to add another LFO and map this to the octave control. I'm going to set that to random. If it's a little too fast, I can decrease the depth. If I smooth this a little bit, it'll make the jumps less extreme. As you can see, there are a lot of ways to interface with Norns now that we have the full control of Ableton. But I find that as far as performing goes, I get a lot more use out of TouchOSC because it gives me hands-on control. TouchOSC is a free program for desktop, iOS, and Android. It allows you to build your own MIDI controllers using the stock devices they provide, or if you know how to code in Lua, you can also use their scripting engine to get into some more of the advanced functionality. I find I get a ton out of the program even with no scripting ability. To start creating a template, you press this plus button and you'll see a menu pop up of a bunch of different objects you can add. For now, I'm just going to add a couple faders and a couple buttons. I'm going to resize them. Now if I hit this play button, I can start using the controller. TouchOSC sends MIDI over Wi-Fi. One thing you'll need to download is the TouchOSC bridge. On this MIDI track, I'm going to set the MIDI in from TouchOSC bridge and the MIDI out to Focusrite USB again. Now if I return to the mapping menu and select learn, I can control the volume of buffer 1 with this fader. I'm going to map the octave again as well. I'm going to once again set the range to -4 and +4. Go to learn. Now I want the buttons to behave as momentary volume jumps to full and momentary octave jumps to 4. So I know that the CC number of volume is 0 and the CC number of the octave is 1. So if I hit this button in the corner, I'm returned to the edit page. If I select this button, I bring up the menu. In this MIDI menu, I'm going to set the controller to constant and set it to 0. And for this button, I'm going to set controller to constant and set it to 1. Now if I hit play again, now this button will jump to 4 octaves, but it returns to -4. So I want to make it return to 0. So if I go back to this MIDI page, I can set the scale, the lower limits of the scale, to about halfway. Now it'll return to 0. The final topic I wanted to go over is something that I touched on briefly in the last video, but I feel like I didn't go into deep enough, which is how to sequence external gear with Norns. So on this MIDI track, I have MIDI coming from the USB, Focusrite USB, which is the Norns, and then the MIDI is going out to the Moog matriarch. I'm using Fall once again, and Fall is going to be sequencing the Moog. I'm going to increase the number of MIDI notes, and if I open up the cutoff on the Moog, you'll hear that. Hopefully this video answered any remaining questions regarding how I use MIDI with Norns. I'm a really big fan of how easy it is to map different parameters and the creative potential that opens up. Thank you for watching. As always, if you have any topic requests, leave a comment below. I'll see you next time.